All right, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked. And as always, I'm stoked to be sitting down and dialoguing about the things before us with Tony and with Phil. And we're actually just talking about things that are going on in our lives and how it continues to progress. And it's the same with everyone, whether it's a tragedy or whether it's joy and jubilation. These days continue to go on. I mean, I think if every one of us looks back and goes, oh my gosh, what was going on a year ago today with COVID and with the lockdowns and with the unrest, it's surprising what has happened in a year. And, you know, since we've just hit Easter, and we were talking about on our last Uncorked, we were talking about, and Phil, you use this wording, perpetual Good Friday, and it just is so resonated and sunk deep into just the core of some of the things that I've been thinking about. And I've been wondering, you know, what would that look like? What would it look like for the church to continually be perpetuating not just the Easter celebration, but Good Friday and Sunday, the whole thing? And what would that mean for the church today? And so continuing with the dialogue, you know, is today the truth of who God is real? Is it real for the church? So if we were to perpetuate, as you had mentioned, Phil, perpetuate Good Friday and all that was meant to be stirred up and all that's meant to be remembered. Remember this, you know, just like communion, each time you celebrate this, remember. So what would you think, each one of you, you know, in our different contexts, we each have a different role with the church, with the community, with the kingdom. And yet we're still pushing for the same thing: reconciliation, redemption, the whole, you know, being long suffering. What would perpetual Good Friday, what would this look like, do you think? How could the church step into this so that Easter and Christmas are not just two Sunday celebrations? What would it look like for a perpetual Good Friday in your estimation? And how significant would that be right here and now, April 2020, for the rest of the year moving forward? Because there are things moving in front of the church right now, and there's some you know, tensions. What is going to happen with the summer, with COVID-19, with restrictions, more people getting vaccinated. Then there's also the tension between vaccination, non-vaccination. So perpetual Good Friday. What are your thoughts on this, guys? Is if the church were going to continue to perpetuate Good Friday, would that be a positive thing? And how would that look at the impact, culturally engaged at a perpetual Good Friday level?
One thing that comes to mind is I think of some churches who talked about race a lot. And in that regard, white people feeling like the bad guy every time you come to church, and what that could do to a church. A couple of examples that I have that I've seen in Portland that went about doing that. It split the church. It really broke things up because you didn't want to come to church and felt like you were the bad guy every day, every week. So I could imagine that being a negative thing, but I think there's something to focusing our attention on the least of these regularly, and coming back to that and reminding ourselves that where we are as believers is because of the work of Christ, not because of our own work. And so there's kind of two facets to it, but I think that we may see it, hey, I don't want to be called the bad guy. I don't want to be reminded of the trauma in my life because I'm reminded when I leave. But yeah, that's part of our existence too. So being reminded of that could pose a kind of a difficult thing. My initial thoughts.
Yeah, with Perpetual Good Friday, I think it's important for us to clarify that it's not something that's new that's being proposed. It's actually within the Christian tradition. It goes by other terms such as a cruciform ministry. And Dr. Harper at Multnomah talks about this all the time. But I'm probably going to misquote him. He talks about how within the medieval church, the cross is never depicted without Jesus. But what we see often today is an empty cross. but there's something to the medieval church's Christology, that the cross is not a symbol. It's not this empty relic, but the cross only has meaning because of who died upon it. And I wonder if that isn't an appropriate metaphor for our Western Christianity. We have an empty cross because we might have a Christless Christianity. And this is why a perpetual Good Friday is a posture of perpetual Good Friday may be a viable path for Western Christianity, is because we need to disillusion ourselves of any notion of a triumphal Christianity that supersedes this crucifixion. Any notion of victory that is empty of suffering and loss experienced by God, and therefore is a part of the Christian life, is in a sense not Christian. And so I think what Perpetual Good Friday or a cruciform ministry captures for us is the essential characteristic of what Christianity is. We can not stray away from the foot of the cross because there our Savior hangs. We can talk about Resurrection Sunday all we want, but it almost feels very anthropocentric, not Christocentric, because we keep talking about what we now need to do because God is risen, rather than what God continues to do as the risen Lord, because he is the crucified Lord. And so these are, I think, the realms or the categories that I'd like to stick close to, is that, yes, Perpetual Good Friday is within the Christian tradition. And two, we can't have an empty cross because it's Jesus who saves, not the cross.
Yeah, another thing with that too is just the empty cross notion. The work is done is kind of implied through the empty cross. Like, I mean, you mentioned a moment ago, Tony, God is continuing to do work. So yeah, understanding that and keeping that central to how we view. And I guess two other things came to mind as well. First off, thinking of the depictions of Jesus on the cross, the agony, the pain, and everything that's there, having that front and center to our Christian walk. What would that reflection do if we came to church every single time and reminded, and our attention drawn to a broken Jesus on the cross to bring us back to that moment? Yeah, we'd begin every service pretty somber at that moment, probably. But another thing is just as we go through Passion Week or Holy Week, those kind of things, the daily reminders of the various aspects of the cross. And most Christians I talk to, there's something from that week, if it's not Good Friday, something into that during season of Lent, right before then, where they're reminded of something. And it's like, we almost should be reminding ourselves of this constantly. This should be something that should be a regular part of our life, that we're reminded of his brokenness in light of our brokenness, and those two playing off of one another, and just living a life of consistently reminding of the brokenness, but know that we do have the resurrection that we're living in, but being reminded back to that, kind of bringing us down to that moment every time. So yeah, that's
It is interesting that the idea of remembrance seems good only for a given moment, but then when you remember the cross, or you remember the sacrifice or the surrender that Christ did, and seek to ask people to participate in it, that's where people kind of recoil a little bit, and this remembering is only good if it's just mental, I feel like, for the church. It's just this, I've said it before, that instead of becoming practical, active Christians, we are just psychological. We think good thoughts. And so if only you think good thoughts, then you're a good Christian, good in quotation marks. And I wonder if that's the case, because America for sure is so, and really, it is really hell-bent on victory. And yes, absolutely. One of the questions I ask students sometimes when we start, if I'm teaching a theology class or a New Testament survey, or even, teaching at the church, I ask, what was done on the cross? Because I believe that there's victory. The cross is empty, Christ is, and yet if I live though, as if the cross is empty, do I live in empty Christianity because myself isn't required to make that sacrifice? And so I wonder sometimes if that is true, like there's this tension there, and the church hasn't done well enough to understand that we live in between. The here and now is in between heaven, and hell in a sense, and not that they're geographic places, right? Heaven's up here, hell's down there. But I feel like we live in this in between, and we don't want to fill the in between with significance and weighty things, life. Instead, what we'd like to do is numb ourselves with the material drive, with the drive towards power. It's interesting now with the reemergence of Dr. Jordan Peterson, and this really, you see how these cultural icons, people just become icons that we just seek after. And so I almost feel like that the cross is a better icon, and it's a better, like you're saying, Tony, the medieval time, it was not a symbol. It was the truth. And yet sometimes I believe in the 21st century, the cross makes a better icon, a better, a wall of fiction than the truth of my life. How does that change though? Like, how do we do that without, or are we barking up the wrong tree? Like, if this is the way that the church is, if we look around and we see, hey, people are making some decent sacrifice, and they're engaging these topics, but how far is, far enough? Or how much do people have to engage in order for it to be a perpetual good? Like, you know what I'm saying? It's like these levels, because I don't want to get into levels of, oh my gosh, well, that's a good Christian because they're engaging that much. Where's the heart of the church that needs to be this perpetually pushing into Good Friday, not living as though we're just saddened and everyone's like, I don't want to become a Christian. It's so depressing. It's always Good Friday.
Yeah, to your point, Matt, I agree. In some ways, the cross is a better icon of what the Christian life is than our own lives in our contemporary times. But I wonder if it isn't because we don't take we don't model our lives after what the cross depicts. I wonder if it isn't because we've strayed so far with our own personal narratives in regards to what Christians are meant to do and be and look like, and then conform the story of the cross to that. I wonder if it isn't a both and, where yes, the cross is a Christian icon, but if it doesn't serve as a medium or a reminder of what the Christian life should be and how the Christian life should conform, because the cross only finds its meaning from Jesus and from the life of the church. But because now we've so privatized and personalized, in a negative way, personalized or self-centered the Christian life on ourselves, the cross has lost its meaning, and therefore we've lost our meaning. Because Robert Jensen and other theologians will say, I think this is Robert Jensen, but when asked, like, when were they saved? As contemporary Western Christians, we think, oh, I was at this youth rally or at this camp, I was 13, and I asked the Lord until my heart, I prayed the sinner's prayer. Theologians like Robert Jensen will say, no, I was saved 2,000 years ago on the cross. And that's the greater narrative, the meta narrative that we're caught up under and caught up in. And so this isn't to say that Christians don't have a personal experience of God and of the Christian life, but it can never be a self-centered personalization. It can be personalized, but it can never be self-centered. And so whenever Augustine talks about sin as the warping of desire and the inward turning of it, I think that's what we're trying to combat. It isn't to say that we don't all have an inward journey that we have to take, but it's to say that inward journey can never be only about us. And so the cross pulls us out of ourselves, so that we can better understand the inwardmost part of ourselves.
Yeah, I wonder, again, I totally saved 2,000 years ago, right? And again, saved, when it comes to salvation, does the church press into saved from, but also saved for? And, especially in light of what's gone on with this last week, how does the church respond with a couple, unfortunately, when we talk about multiple shootings, that's just, and was talking this week to some folks about this idea of my son's reading this book about mediation and how, we're mediated. And it's interesting how the church is meant to be mediated. The church is meant to be understood through the cross, that cruciform life that you had mentioned earlier, Tony. And yet I think, though, that the church actually steps in and seeks to, and this is my take on today's current culture of the church. This is why we see the infighting and the lack of consistency or coherency with the church in responding to the rate, because there is racial injustice in unrest, right? The injustice is all around. We see it play out as it's a bummer that as society opens up a bit more, what happens are more shootings and more violence erupts, and it really is playing out. As much as I wish that I could say that the image, the representation, the mediation of the church today is the cross. It's the cruciform living. I'm not sure that's the case. And so when I think that when people see the church today and they see the church is wanting to get its power, just like every other institution, it's nothing more than an institution. It's almost as if the church has become more like the Old Testament temple, a building. It's structured rather than what it was meant to be, with the Lord leading the people in the wilderness, out in the land, by fire, by cloud, and there was, and what you're talking about, Tony, with that's the real personalization of religion, right? Is when it's so personal that you're together as a group. I mean, what each other does. Think about traveling in the desert or at night and stuff. Everywhere from when someone leaves the group, they're probably going to, relieve themselves, or when someone is having a quarrel, with one another, the group, because you're personally attuned in touch with each other, because you have to rely on it. The church today has gotten away, I think, from relying on one another. It's and Tony said this, it's anthropocentric. The Christocentrism of the church has become just nothing more than a label. Oh, it should be this. And so that's why I'm saying is like the realization, the truth of the church should be the cross, this cruciform living with Christ there, but it's become nothing more than, we look at it as this symbol on the wall and we go, oh, look at it. See, I've got this on the wall. This is good for me. I've got my books displayed that show my Christian. Then when you look at my life, though, people say, well, where's the cross and how do you live that out? And you're like, whoa, my relationship, it depends on what song you want to sing, right? You've got REM's, my personal religion, or you've got someone like Johnny Cash doing the remake of Nine Inch Nails and Hurt, or this is, I've hurt myself to, you can have my own crown, this crown of shit, because I built it up on my stuff. The cross doesn't, it's like this song, this band Tool, he sings this song where it says, get down off the cross because we have to nail the next one up there, because we have our heroes. And I think we've talked about this. Christianity in the American sense, westernized Christianity, is looking for a hero. The Bible never portrays Jesus as a hero. He's not a superhero. This God is not this superhero who he rips off his, white robe and shows his big J on his front. He's like, I'm Jesus, woo. It's like we have him in between. We can't decide. Is he a WWE wrestler, or is he a DC Marvel, comic book hero? It's like, dudes, he's human. And he did human things, but he's also divine. And guess what? That's the truth of me and you when we step into who Christ is through the Spirit. But how many in the church want that to be our truth? Because, Phil, there's no reason why people aren't stepping into the places in Portland, where like the homeless shelters. And like, why isn't the church doing these things? Why do we need tragedy to unify?
Yeah, real talk. Because I think in the moment we do have tragedy, I think we're reminded of how much need is actually out there. But again, we're approaching it as many of us are approaching it as it's to the furthest extent of our outstretched arm. We're like, well, I got to go help the people that need something because I'm good. The work of Christ has been done in my life, and there's no more correction, no more work that needs to happen in my life, when that's not the case. When we think of Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor, thinking of ourselves as poor spiritually, thinking of ourselves as just poor, when the paradigm is us versus God, our holiness compared to Christ's holiness, our righteousness compared to Christ's righteousness, we're consistently poor, and we stay in the realm of creation. And yeah, so there's definitely being reminded at the moment of tragedy that we need to go and help people, but tragedy is always there. The poor is always with us, and we ourselves are always poor. So we neglect that when we think of the work has been done already. And weeks like this week has reminded us, thinking of what happened in Minnesota, just a little ways away from where Derek Chauvin's trial is happening. Yeah, it's happening again. And then we had another one just last night again, right? And so, yep. Again, we have these things going on, and it's in one regard, it's very easy to kind of just say, oh man, this is going to happen again. But yeah, we're reminded again, yeah, this stuff is always going to happen. So there's always work to be done. There's always things we need to say and things we need to do. So.
Yeah. And I mean, I know people are going to point to, especially the one with, last night with Adam, I think his first name's Adam, Toledo, 13-year-old boy. To me, it is tragedy all around. Okay, gun involved. He's hanging with the 21-year-old. There, whatever. The fact is that like I was listening to this one interview and talking about, the boy was out 2:40 in the morning out on the street. Yeah, okay. But it doesn't so we put all these things together to try to justify what in the end has happened. A cop has shot, this 13-year-old. Where's it? I look at it and I know people are like, oh man, that's spiritualizing everything. The fact that the 21 and a 14-year-old didn't feel anywhere in their community in Chicago where they could go be with people who love them says a lot to me. I mean, I know that we need to talk about the issue between policing but it goes even into that too. The way to deal with systemic evil and systemic issues is not a case-by-case basis. And I feel like that's what we do with the Black Lives Matter, the Blue Lives Matter, the All Lives Matter, the People Matter, the police brutality, any criminality. We deal with it such on a one-to-one basis that the church never steps in and says, hey, look, if we were ministers of reconciliation, then situations like this, they wouldn't happen. And yeah, granted, that's an idealized world. And I know that that's not going to happen right here and now. But if my push is to be heaven on earth, Bonhoeffer talks about this, and even, Bart, what does it mean to be fully human? Is it the fact, and I've been wrestling with this, has the Christian lost the sense of becoming more human than actually the world, to where then we stop at what the world is okay with being human, the materialism and things like this. And what I wonder is when Bonhoeffer and Barth and some of these theologians talked about being fully human, like Christ was fully human, it means getting in so tight with the people that you are in with your life, that you understand their fleshly desires, that you understand what it means to hurt, but also what it means to pine after people of the opposite sex, people of the same sex, pining after power, pining after money, pining after violence, like to be fully human means to be in tune, to be honest with myself, that says, dude, at any given moment, I could be George Floyd or Derek Chauvin. Like I could be these people. I am these people. So understanding my humanness. But I feel like because of the empty cross, to be a Christian, you must be overly pious. It's almost as if we've taken the truth of the gritty humanness of being real in today's world. And what we've done is said, well, but if you're a Christian, it needs to look squeaky clean. So you've got the guys like the Liberty President or Metaxas or Driscoll, and you've got these leaders who, hey, as long as Sunday preaching the cross, talk about Jesus and your sin, but then for the rest of the week, it doesn't matter because we can, whitewash sepulchres, right? Like this is the thing, we're whitewashed tombs. So how do we break into the mold of what has become the 21st century Christian and start to chip away and see the David in there, the statue that Michelangelo looked at and said, no, there's something there. How do we see what Jesus sees in each one of us?
Yeah, Matt, I think what's should be abundantly clear and has been abundantly clear, but we still see this time and time again. So we see with Adam Toledo, this 13-year-old kid, really, who was shot, and he didn't have a gun. And then we see Kyle Rittenhouse, who's able to walk down the streets of Kenosha with an AR. One was protected by the police and had a firearm, and the other was executed and was not given any protection. And I think where I struggle with this is, and I'm not saying this is what you're saying, Matt, but what happens is we refuse to humanize somebody until we place ourselves in their shoes. And I struggle greatly with that because once again, it's still self-centeredness. It's selfish. Until we can place ourselves in somebody else's shoes, they will not be humanized to us. They have no value to us. And what's then difficult is, practically speaking, a white person will not value the life of a Black person or a person of color until they can place themselves in that person's shoes. Well, guess what? They will never be able to place themselves in that person's shoes. And then what we happen is, when white people do short-term mission trips and they go to Mexico and then they try to help these Mexican orphans, but when these Mexican orphans come to the border, they get placed in cages. White people will never be able to place themselves in the shoes of people of color and Black people. And what becomes more difficult is then the narrative and the story and the work will always be centered on white people. That until I can be in their shoes and live vicariously through their suffering, they cannot be human. But the thing is, this extends beyond just racial issues. This also extends to gender inequality. until men can experience the suffering and the oppression of women, I can't empathize. Get out of here. Get out of here with that. Come on now. And so I think what a cruciform theology, what a Christocentric theology offers us is this. Jesus doesn't say, I have to wait to put myself in their shoes and then I can suffer alongside them. Jesus chooses to suffer alongside us. He becomes the very thing that is experiencing suffering. He doesn't suffer apart or removed from, but he suffers with. He doesn't have to say, I have to imagine what it is that they're going through in order to take up their cause. He takes up our cause because he enters our suffering with us. It's not some cavalier Messiah complex. Jesus saves us because he experiences with us that which we experience. And so I'm not trying to come down hard on white people or men. I'm trying to say the only viable path forward is if we choose to suffer with one another. There can be no outside savior. We cannot, because what we see is an outside savior only produces unequitable metrics. Because when Adam Toledo, who is a kid, is executed, but Kyle Rittenhouse, who is 17 and is on his way to manhood, is protected by the police. And please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Kyle Rittenhouse should have been executed. I'm not saying he should have been killed by the police. What I'm saying is our system and our structures privilege white people over people of color and black people.
Tony and Phil, I don't mean to jump in, Phil, but Tony, I want to, man, okay, let's take this thing, play it out. If what you're saying is true, and I've heard this said, and I totally appreciate it, oh, you got to walk in their shoes. Like To Kill a Mockingbird, I use that quotation all the time. Harper Lee, in order to understand a person, you have to walk in their skin. To your point, though, Tony, you're right. I'm never going to be able to walk in your skin. Never going to be able to walk in Phil's skin. Okay. So will Matt Farlow ever really know what it means to be Phil Berlin or Tony Wynn? Absolutely not. Right. I can't. And yet, isn't there something about this is the unfathomable paradox that Kierkegaard talks about the Christian faith, that in a sense, though, if I am in Christ, I don't have to go through, because take it to the extreme, that Kyle kid would have to be shot if the white people want to walk in the skin of Adam Toledo's family, of George Floyd's family. Going back to 1975, George Jackson was shot in San Quentin. If my family, if I want to walk in the skin of Phil Berlin and Tony Wynn and folks of color, wouldn't I have to have someone? I mean, let's be realistic. It can't be both ways. If white people say, oh, well, we got to have experiences, so I have to go and serve. And okay, how far do you want to take that, though, white people, if you have to? So in some sense, it has to be done through a faith that is interdependent and interrelated, because while I can never have the exact experience and truth of what it means to be you, Tony, or you, Phil, the more I live with you, the more I interact with you, then the more your personhood becomes part of me, and the more my personhood becomes part of you. And then I don't need to find ways to justify whether I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, nor do you need to find ways to, because now we start to bleed with each other. We start to cry with each other. I feel like we've lost the in Christness almost within the church, where the spirit is meant to be unified, to where then I don't need to go looking for experiences to know that what you're telling me is true, that I need to experience something in order to validate what your experience is. And I think that's what I'm hearing you saying, Tony, and you're spot on. And that's where I'm like, dudes, this is why we need more people. I don't give a crap what you look like, to be honest. If you love Jesus, then when you're up front in the church and you're leading the church and the spirit is moving through you, I'm going to follow you, because you are in the sense more human. You recognize what it means to be human, but you're more Christ because you understand that surrender, that sacrifice, that cruciform living that sees the need for me just as much as the need for you, you know. And it's something that, like, I can tell you all these things that you need to be doing, get in the Bible, do all this. It really is a spiritual thing that can only be experienced, though, in the community of us, you know, people who love Jesus. And then when you start saying that kind of stuff, Tony, I don't hear you bashing on white people. I hear you speaking truth. And I'm like, yeah, right? Because then we understand that you're not about beating up, just like Dr. King said, his move wasn't to beat up white people. It was to beat out racism. It was to beat out injustice. You know, it's not about going at people. It's going at the unfortunate infections of thought that have just warped the heart. You know, Christ was after the heart. If it was about like changing people's behaviors and getting them to experience things, wouldn't he then have made I'm not going to talk about the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to experience, you know, instead he was always making sure that people saw the other in front of them. And that's how I can't walk in your shoes, in your skin, but man, I can continue to understand more and more of you the more I respond and relate to you. I'm interdependent, that perichoretic interdependence that I think the church has lost it. It's too easy to be, you know, individual monads, you know, these self-directed monads. I'm going to do my thing. The suburban life is the icon of the Christian church. I have my garage, my self-included house. I leave my own dwelling with the people that I choose, you know, and I go and basically exert my power on everyone else. And then I come back to my own place and we might pray. We might have a crucifix on the wall and all that stuff, but it's not interdependent in outside of my own core tribe. You know, what has made us as Christians in the 21st century think that that's okay?
And Phil, you totally take over after this. I'll just say very quickly to your point, Matt. I think it's we've lost the idea that my suffering is your suffering. As the community of Christ, there are no families within the church because the church is one family. The strongest relationship in the church is not father, mother, son or daughter. It's actually brother and sister, because we're all brother and sister. And that's the strongest relational bond. And because the church, the Western church, in this current moment has family ministries. And like you said, everything it's in its own monads. Like we can only experience suffering vicariously rather than suffering interpersonally. The way forward is my suffering is your suffering is my suffering. So for all the people who want to do colorblind ministry and whatever, we can only get there if you are willing to accept my suffering as your suffering unequivocally. No questions asked. The minute I tell you I'm suffering, you have to accept that wholesale. And then we will work out the practicalities of that on the other end. But until we get past the idea that we have to gauge your suffering and figure out if your suffering is real, that's when we get all the messy stuff on the other end, and then we get people faking their suffering. But if we take the suffering of Black people and of women seriously, we won't have all these minority cases of people pretending like they're suffering. And so I think if my suffering is your suffering is my suffering, that's the foundation we have to build upon. And then we can move past race. We can move beyond race. Because then when somebody dies in the Black community at the hands of police brutality, we all understand that that person's suffering and their family suffering is our suffering. And then they're humanized. And then they're no longer seen by the system as this Black person and the like. But because we don't see the crime as what it is, we dehumanize. That's why it's so important right now. We have to talk about it being specifically Black. Until we see them as Black, we can't see them as human. And so that's where we're at.
Yeah, definitely, man. And no problem. Again, amens all over the place from what you guys are sharing. At the same token, we have to remember we have a history of all of this, right? And so there's been a long-standing history that has developed walls of distrust that when our white brothers and sisters try to come into this conversation, there's a lot of Black brothers that are like, okay, what are you doing here? Wait, why are you here again? Okay, how about just sit in the corner for a second, or just don't show up here at all? And so there's those walls of distrust, and there's so much that we need to, I mean, as we talked about, just the perpetualness of the Good Friday. It's a continual thing where we're becoming Christian. We're becoming a community in this regard. And so it's going to be more than just one occasion of this, one attempt at this. This is going to be years and years of building this community. It's not going to happen quick. We're not going to make fast friends here, or definitely not fast brothers, where we're able to kind of establish and reestablish this trust. This is going to be a consistent thing that very often we're going to get wrong as we're coming together and we're going to say the wrong things, but man, that's going to be part of our faith, right? Is just having trust in my brother that he's here for goodwill. And that's not the easiest thing to develop. And yeah, man, that's the work that we need to start. I believe has been starting, but it gets short-circuited because we look at the empty cross thinking, man, I did it once. I'm helping the poor people. I'm good. I'm doing what I need to. It's like, no, there's so much more. When you can actually see and actually feel one another's pain, there's so much more work to do to get to that point. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to continue this next week. We appreciate each one of you joining us. Be mindful that all of New Wine videos and teachings can be found on YouTube. And for those of you that are watching this, just mark on your calendar at 10 a.m. because what we're going to start doing is we're going to hit some live broadcast of this on our YouTube, where then you can have actually real-time interaction. We're just going to play around with that because faith is real time. Faith is real time. And what we don't want, and this is a bummer to me, is to have competing narratives of which people group or which people are suffering more, negatively. And we'll talk about this next week. Suffering, the Toledo family is suffering. That's not the suffering we're talking about. The Floyd family, that's not the suffering that we're talking about. Like that, when we suffer with each other, there are forms of redemptive, righteous suffering. And so what does that look like? If the church today chooses their God, what God do we have? Do we have a suffering servant, or do we have a victorious superhero? So again, on behalf of Tony and Phil, I'm Matt, and this has been New Wine UnCorked. Go on up there right now on the YouTube page and hit subscribe. That way, each time a New Wine video drops, whether it's New Wine tastings, New Wines UnCorked, you will be informed. And then also just take a chance right now and hit the plus button right there for a new tab and type in Facebook/New Wine Skins. And like us on Facebook as well, so that you'll be informed with the things that are going on with New Wine. And finally, head on over to our webpage, new-wineskins.org. And that way you can sign up for our newsletter and find ways to get involved with New Wine Skins, cultural engagement, Christ-centered, spirit-led. And that's what we're all about. So until next week, Phil, Tony, I'm Matt. This has been New Wine UnCorked. We'll see you on the flip side.